Good afternoon and welcome to the RespectAbility webinar for December 6th, 2016. I'm delighted that all of you are able to join us today, and I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues, Janie and Eddie Ellis. And today we're going to be talking about an intersection of issues which really impact millions of Americans and has not been given the attention by the news media, by policymakers that it really deserves. And so, as the title suggests, today we're talking about disability and criminal justice reform. We're going to be talking through our report, which was released in June, talking about people with disabilities, talking about the challenges they face, interacting with all parts of the criminal justice system. We're going to talk about some of the ideas and best practices that we want to see reflected in any kind of reform measure that is being considered by Congress. There's a lot of uncertainty moving forward about what shape criminal justice reform is going to take, if any, under the new administration, under the new Attorney General, but we very much feel that this is in the best interest of the left and the right in America to really seriously consider the disparate impact that our justice system has on people with multiple minority status, particularly the challenges faced by people with disabilities who also happen to be members of a religious or ethnic minority. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues today. We're going to be talking with you through a lot of data, a lot of ideas, and I will be sending along a PowerPoint, the copy of the PowerPoint if anybody wants to look in more detail about what we're talking about today. So first and foremost, I want to extend a deep thanks to JP Morgan Chase & Company for their support of our webinar program. They have enabled us to be able to offer to you, our subscribers and our partners, these free learning opportunities to go in depth on these critical issues. And they also enable us to have the captioning and enable us to have this platform. So our deepest thanks to them. And so I'm going to start by introducing you to everyone who's going to be presenting today. We have with us Janie Jeffers, who's the founder and president of Jeffers and Associates. A selection of her career covers a lot of very involved positions in the justice system. President Bill Clinton appointed her as a commissioner of the U.S. Parole Commission in 1999. She has also served as the executive deputy director of the D.C. Interagency Task Force at the Office of Management and Budget, where she provided technical assistance to the D.C. government. And from 1992 to 1996, she was chief at the National Office of Citizen Participation for the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice, and from 1985 to 1991, she was the Deputy Commissioner for the New York City's Department of Correction, rising through the ranks to become the first civilian to achieve that position. She was a wonderful partner in helping us develop our criminal justice reform. As we were learning and understanding these issues, she provided a very clear sense of the really difficult challenges faced by corrections professionals in serving the prison population and safeguarding their rights and interests. And we are glad to have her. She's going to be talking through the recommendations of our report, and she's also going to be chiming in if there's any points that needs to be made. I'm also joined today by Eddie B. Ellis, Jr., founder of One by One. Ellis created One by One, an organization that works with communities and partners to provide youth development workshops and mentoring services to keep youth out of the corrections system, out of the school-to-prison pipeline, and helping them, when they do exit the system, to stay out. He is a champion for change. His own experiences as a former convict provides insight and depth to his work, and it allows him to connect and engage with audiences. He speaks very movingly and very compassionately about his own experiences, his own challenges, and is really leveraging his lived experience to helping others. He provides professional training in writing as a resource to the community, and he has helped write several resource guides offering service referrals, practical tips, and inspiration to returning citizens and parolees. And he is all over the place in the D.C. metro area. He has been a wonderful partner as well, and he's going to be talking about his personal story and his insights that he helped shape with this report. And I am Pauli. I'm the Policy and Practices Director for RespectAbility. I oversee our outreach to leaders in the states on Capitol Hill. I help coordinate our policy writing. I help coordinate these webinars, and it is with a great deal of humility and recognition of great challenges ahead that I'm speaking to you today. So as many of you have seen, if you've been following us over the last several months, back in June, we released an extensive report about the challenges facing people with disabilities in the criminal justice system. What we did was we looked at data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics and really analyzed it to say, hey, how many people with disabilities interact with the justice system, how many are involved with the criminal justice system, and how many are leaving the system? What is driving the high recidivism rates that we see year in and year out? And this report really looked at old data, but in a new way. And we had a big event on Capitol Hill. We had presentations, we had speakers, and we also have a video recording of that should be in the chat box. I invite you to read the report, to download it, and to share our ideas and insights. And so today we're going to be walking you through kind of our thought process in going through that document and our recommendations. So you're probably wondering, why should a disability organization care about criminal justice reform? Well, obviously one of the biggest answers is intersectionality. That is, the profound commitment that all of us need to have to check our privileges, to recognize the systems of oppression which define the lives of far too many of our fellow Americans. And think about it this way. The United States is home to only 5% of the world's population. However, we actually host 25% of the world's prison population. For a country that claims and professes to be the land of the free, that is an appalling number. Millions of Americans are incarcerated, and they experience great challenges in the system and out of the system. 2.2 million people are actually in our prisons and our jails now. This is a 500% increase over the last 30 years. The federal prison population alone has increased from 25,000 to over 219,000 over the last several decades, a 790% increase. And accounting for many of those numbers and the high rates are things like prohibition on certain kinds of drugs, the war on drugs. In fact, 60% of those who are incarcerated in federal prison are non-violent offenders who have run afoul of mandatory minimum sentences or other issues. The system itself costs the American taxpayer $80 billion a year for a system that dehumanizes, exploits, and abuses far too many people. More than 60% of people in prison are a racial or ethnic minority. Many people have written very movingly and talked very openly about the disparate impact that race and racism and systems of oppression have on the lives of too many. And I think the prison system is very reflective of the abuse of power in some cases and the structures that define our society. At the local level, jails process more than 12 million people per year and have a disproportionate impact on communities of color. Nationally, African Americans are jailed at a rate 4 times that of white Americans. Between 70 and 100 million Americans, almost 1 in 3 actually has some kind of a criminal record, which brings lifelong barriers and significant stigmas. And so these reasons are why we as a community should care about criminal justice reform. And so looking at the reports and the data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, we found that a survey they completed recently showed 32% of federal prisoners have at least one disability, and 40% of jail inmates report having at least one disability. And looking at that, comparing it to the overall prison population, the estimate, and it's a conservative estimate, is that there are over 750,000 Americans with disabilities behind bars currently. And that is a huge number, and it is a number which has escaped the notice of many of the conversations that our nation's leaders have had around criminal justice reform. The origins of our report came out of several events that we attended through the White House Office of Public Engagement. The White House, for Reentry Week back in April, hosted dozens of events about criminal justice, the criminal justice system, about the need for reform, about the challenges facing people who are getting out of prison, the high recidivism rate, and I'll explain that term soon. And every event we went to, there was a significant word missing, and the missing word was disability. Nobody was talking about people with disabilities. There was nobody talking about cognitive disabilities. Nobody was talking about intellectual or developmental disabilities. Nobody was talking about physical disabilities. If any discussion came up, there was discussion, oh, our mental health issues are bad in prison, or, well, lots of people drop out of school. But there was a lot of missing pieces. And so in conversations we had with the White House and Valerie Jarrett, we put together this report to really raise the awareness of people outside of the disability community of the impact and shadow of disability, but also to really encourage others in the community to get out there and start talking with organizations who are working on these issues. We are far from the first disability organization to talk about the disparate impacts of race and criminal justice, but we felt that there was a chance and an opportunity to really leverage our own insights and to share best practices, which is one of the fundamental things that we do to end stigmas and advance opportunities. And so looking more deeply at the data, the estimate that we created was that looking at the Bureau of Justice numbers, looking at 40% of people in jail and 32% of people in prison, the estimate we came out with was that there are 750,000 Americans with disabilities. And looking at the diagnostic from the Department of Justice, it covered vision differences, hearing differences, ambulatory issues, cognitive self-care, and independent living. And so on this slide that everyone should be seeing right now, we have a table that breaks down the percentages based on the report and our estimates looking at, from the Prison Policy Initiative, the overall prison population. This is a rough estimate, and I cannot emphasize that enough, but even so, even if this is the most conservative estimate, that still shows that 750,000 people have disabilities behind bars, and that's a problem. And it's not an issue which is getting the national attention that it deserves. So, for those who might be unfamiliar with disability issues, who has a disability, well, nearly everyone in some ways. 1 in 5 Americans has a disability that totals more than 56 million Americans, with differences of hearing, seeing, ambulatory differences, cognitive differences, and intellectual and developmental differences. And at some point, we emphasize time and again in our workforce efforts and in our criminal justice presentations, we always talk about the fact that not all disabilities can be seen. Many are invisible, that is, they're learning differences, they're cognitive differences. They are differences that we may be born with or we may acquire, such as a traumatic brain injury. And so looking at our report, one of the things we tried to do was we tried to show examples where the disability issue was ignored in the national conversation. And one of the examples that we gravitated to was Freddie Gray, and his death in Baltimore shocked the nation. But what many people don't realize was that he had significant developmental disabilities due to environmental exposures that are intrinsically linked to poverty and the types of lead paint that are in far too many communities. And so looking at these examples, we see far too many people who have disabilities, and their disability contributes to the process whereby they encounter challenges in school, they fall into the cycling in and out of the system, and they fall through the cracks of our society. And one of the things that we raise in our communications with others working on the criminal justice issues is the catch-all term of executive function disorders, which covers a lot of issues ranging from learning differences to executive functioning issues due to traumatic brain injury to things that cause people to really have challenges following multi-step instructions. And so this slide has an image of a pictorial diagram which explains how to do something, a simple life skill such as washing your hands. And we talk in our report about the difference between can't and won't. And these types of challenges, which have all sorts of tertiary effects in people's lives, need to be thought about in a more systematic way. So in our report, we offer definitions of key terms because people are always asking, well, what definition of disability are you using in your data? And so we have here a selection of key terms such as disability, such as ableism, which is discrimination in favor of able-bodied people, and the belief that people who have disabilities are somehow less human, less valuable, and less capable than others. We talk about accommodations, that is, any change in the work environment or in way things done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal access and treatment. And we talk quite a bit about the ADA, that's the Americans with Disabilities Act. We also talk about several key terms from the incarceration system. We talk about returning citizens, which is a term for people who have been guilty of a crime and have completed their sentence and are returning home. Recidivism is a term that we use frequently because the recidivism rate is very high, and we're going to talk about those numbers soon. Recidivism is the rearrest, reconviction, or reincarceration of an ex-offender within a given time frame. We also talk a lot about intersectionality, which refers to the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, gender, as they apply to a given individual or a group, regarded as overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. This is in many ways a buzzword, but more importantly, it is really a call to action to people to think through what it means to look at the disparate impacts of race in the criminal justice system. It calls attention to the multiple layers of oppression and privilege and prejudice, which really define the lives of far too many. And so some of the key takeaways that we want people to think about and what we think are some of the key points to follow is that 95% of people who are in prison will eventually be released and returned home. Very few people are serving life sentences. Very few people are on death row. Many people will leave the system, and the society they return to should be responsive to the challenges they face and provide them economic opportunities to reintegrate. Within 5 years, however, as it stands now, 3 out of 4 ex-offenders will be rearrested and re-enter the system. We think that this is a critical point of intervention where, through best practices such as the President Entrepreneurship Program or the Centers for Employment Opportunities, programs that are working directly with returning citizens to get them skills, to get them reintegrated, work, for example, that Eddie does with 1x1, giving mentoring and training, referral to services, that's a critical intervention point where change can happen, and we want to see better efforts to reduce recidivism. And in total, again, 32% of federal prisoners and 40% of people in jail self-report having at least one disability. People with disabilities are also very likely to be involved at some point as victims of crime. There was a new report we'll talk about from the Bureau of Justice Statistics that shows that people with disabilities are twice as likely to be victims of crimes than people without disabilities. And this is the cycle of violence that far too many people experience is something that people are aware of. And as some very powerful leaders in our community like to say, ableism isn't just bad words, it is violence. And that is the fact that we see in the statistics. And on this slide, we talk about how this new report shows that Americans with disabilities are victims of violent crime at a much higher rate than people without disabilities. They are the victims of serious violent crime, including rape, robbery, and aggravated assault at a much higher rate, 41% to 31%. Every year between 2009 and 2014, the rate of violent victimization was at least twice of that for their non-disabled peers. 1 in 5 violent crime victims with disabilities believed that they were targeted specifically because of their disability. And particularly those who had multiple disabilities were very often the victims of violence and particularly rape and sexual assault, and we talk about this extensively in our report. Also, looking at another aspect, another element of the violence in our society, it cannot go unremarked about police violence and the use of force against civilians, particularly African Americans and African American youth. Many people have talked about the loss of the lives in Ferguson, in North Carolina, of far too many young African American men. And I would direct your attention to a report put together by David Perry for the J. Ruderman Foundation, which looked at use of force incidences and actually had an estimate that from 1/3 to nearly half of all police use of force incidences involve a person with a disability. Just this week, we're hearing out of North Carolina the mistrial of the officer-involved shooting of Lamont Scott. And Mr. Scott, who's died, was a person with a disability, and the video that I think many of us saw showed that. And it was the civilian crying out, "He has a disability, leave him alone." It's emblematic of the experience of far too many. And this is why we have other young, wonderful leaders such as Freddie Gray and Valessa Thompson calling out the racial and disability dimensions of police use of force and the call to action of Black Lives Matter. We also, at the same time, want to look in our report about the role of police training, because everyone from minority communities to police themselves have a vested interest in working together to build a safer society. One of the other critical elements of the report that we look at is the connection, the correlation between high school attainment and the prison system. We find from good sources that 67% of those incarcerated in state prisons failed to complete high school, and that 69% of local jail populations were made up of high school dropouts. And this is why in our report we systematically look at are children receiving or not receiving the supports they need to complete high school. And this is, again, a more detailed look at a group of prison inmates. And it found that 59% had a speech disability of some kind, 66% had a learning disability, and only 37% had no disability. And looking at youth with disabilities compared to their peers, we find that only 61% of young people with disabilities will be able to complete a high school diploma, compared to 81% of people without disabilities. That's a 20-point gap, and we're wondering, where is that gap coming from? Even as the White House is proclaiming, oh, we're driving up high school graduation rates, yes, to a point, but there's still significant gaps. And the question now moving forward should be, what about the system isn't serving these children? So we talk in detail about education and students with disabilities. There's actually 1.2 million people with disabilities between the ages of 16 and 20, and I won't read through all of these numbers, but you can find them on our website. So talking about youth with disabilities in the school system, they are suspended at much higher rates than is the average. And we have here on this slide a table which shows the elementary and secondary out-of-school suspension rates by racial and ethnic status. We have African Americans, we have American Indians, Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, Asians, Latinos, whites, English as a second language learners, and people with disabilities. And so the two big numbers that I would call your attention to are the numbers for African American youth and youth with disabilities. We see that in the African American column, 7.6% of students had actually been suspended in elementary school at a much higher rate than any other category. In secondary school, we see 23.2% having been having an out-of-school suspension. These are shocking numbers and show that our school system is not serving these youth. Likewise, the biggest numbers we see are 18.1% of secondary school youth with disabilities having an out-of-school suspension, and 5.4% of youth with disabilities having an out-of-school suspension. And this next slide goes into a little more detail looking at the minority youth side. And above all, minority youth with disabilities are suspended at the highest rates of any group. And so I would invite you to go to the UCLA's Civil Rights Project. They have written very well and very clearly about these very troubling disparate impacts. One of the people that we talked to in putting together our report was Eric Jacobson of the Georgia Developmental Disabilities Council, and he had a quote which really struck a nerve when we were developing this document in partnership with 50 other people, that boys of color are diagnosed with conduct and behavioral disorders, while white kids get diagnosed with autism. And I think that's a very clear statement and a very clear challenge to the community. And this big complicated slide shows you the different categories of sentences that people have. And above all, the biggest numbers, it looks at state prisons, local jails, and federal prisons. And as you can see from the slide, most of the people who are in the criminal justice system are there for nonviolent offenses. This is a slide from the White House report, which looks at the demographic of the incarcerated population. You can see many grew up in foster care, many have received public assistance. They have significant issues with substance abuse and mental health and homelessness, all issues which are deeply interconnected. And skipping ahead a little too fast, but here we see the prevalence of disability, the percentages from that report that we inspired our own work. We see state and federal prisoners versus the general population. And as you can see, all of the numbers are higher with the exception of self-care differences. But looking at a smaller population sample, that is still a huge number. That goes into specific types. This is looking at the jail population separate from the state prison federal prison population. Again, more detail. We also look in our report, and all of these facts are available in accessible forms on our website. We see the disability prevalence by broken down by sex. Here we have number of disabilities reported. The vast majority of people in this report from the BJS reported having at least one disability. And I think there have been some groups out there that have done incredible work raising the voices of people with disabilities who are in the prison system and whose rights are being systematically and routinely violated. I want to call everyone's attention to the great work of the National Disability Rights Network, in particular their chapter in Washington State. Disability Rights Washington has put together some very heartbreaking but very powerful documentaries on the subject of people with disabilities in prison and the lack of accommodations, the lack of supports, the violence that they experience both from their fellow prisoners but also from the guards. And I encourage you all to look into their work, to learn, and to accept it as a call to action and a call to stand up for justice. In our report, we very much wanted to talk about personal stories, and there are several stories that we found which were shocking and which we felt really communicated the message that we had, that people with disabilities are trapped in the prison system and that their needs are not being met, and they deserve to have their rights respected and to complete their sentences, return home. One story we found was a young man named Joseph Hurd, who actually was never released from prison because he's deaf, and nobody had communicated to him through an accessible way, through American Sign Language, that he had completed his sentence and that he was free to go home. Eventually he was able to sue the prison for a violation of his rights, but the fact that his rights were violated in the first place should never have happened. On this next slide, we have the stories of three people who have different disabilities. One person, just Christopher Lopez, who had schizoid affective disorder, he died in police custody. He choked to death because he had been the subject of restraints. Another story we found was somebody named Arthur Johnson, who had intellectual disabilities. During the appeal process of the murder conviction, he claimed that he had been beaten by the police into confessing to the crime, and that he has actually been locked in solitary confinement since 1979. Another person we talk about in our report is Paul Schlosser with bipolar disorder, who was denied medical treatment, was pepper sprayed while being restrained. Another story that we thought was very moving was the experiences of Ameer Baraka, who has appeared now as an actor on the television show, among other things, American Horror Story. Well, he had his own horror story as being someone with dyslexia who fell through the cracks, who dropped out of school, ended up in the justice system, and has since returned to his life and has found success, but he has spoken on Capitol Hill about these issues and his experience. I encourage you to look up his testimony to the Senate Health Committee, which, and then going on, one of the things we talk about in our report is that the experience of being in prison, either as someone with a disability who goes through the system or someone who is in the system as it is, it can cause significant psychological distress. And particularly the experience of solitary confinement is profoundly harrowing. And people come away with lasting either disabilities or experiences that will shape them for the rest of their life. And so this slide shows particularly people with cognitive disabilities, what percentages have experienced a serious psychological distress as a result of their experiences. But the big thing is that, as I said, going back a little bit, 95% of people who are in prison will eventually be released. And each year, according to the Congressional Research Service, 600,000 people leave incarceration. And these are people who have completed their sentences, who deserve the chance to be reintegrated and to become contributing members of society again. We think that this is a critical intervention point because year after year after year, we see a recidivism rate of people being rearrested either for simple parole violations or going on to commit other minor crimes. And we think that they can be prevented. And so in our document, we look at programs and policies that will drive down the recidivism rate and give these people the chance to contribute to society and to get their lives back and to go on to regain their lives. So the bottom line of our report was we kind of looked at three intervention points. Looking at about public policy and thinking about what are the levers we have available as a nation to change things. And so Janie will talk in more detail about this, but the big things that we want people to take away with it is we want to help people from ever falling in through the cracks. And so we think that early interventions to help young people with disabilities from entering the school to prison pipeline is very important to begin with. Next are adequate accommodations in the system itself. Eddie can talk about that in just a moment. And also, again, the importance of having a streamlined reentry process which provides pathways to work and reintegration. And fundamentally, our bottom line message is that only when the system not only identifies but also addresses disability through proper diagnosis, accommodations, and support will criminal justice reform succeed. And so I'm going to shut up now and turn the floor over to Eddie Ellis for him to talk about his experiences. Thank you for joining us, Eddie, and please take it away.
Thank you for having me. And I want to thank RespectAbility, Jennifer, and the organization for allowing me to be a part of this very important topic. As a kid, I was diagnosed with dyslexia. And I had a lot of problems in school with learning because I saw letters and words, numbers backwards. And when that started to happen, I started to deal with a lot of depression because I didn't understand why I was seeing everything backwards at times. And I got some help at school with the dyslexia. And my mom, she helped me at home, but it still didn't explain to me why I was seeing things backwards at times or didn't understand things the way other students may have understood things when teachers asked questions. And as I got older, it started to affect my self-esteem. It started to affect the choices that I made. And I got in trouble and went to the criminal justice system at the age of 16. And I was given 22 years for making some bad choices in my life. And I spent 15 years in prison and 10 years in solitary confinement. And while in prison, I saw a lot of people with disabilities who didn't receive the help that they should have received. And I believe personally that some of the people who were there shouldn't have never been there because the prison wasn't equipped to help the men that I was around who were dealing with disabilities. And I just want to take a step back and say that up until this year, I was never educated enough to understand that the disabilities that I have were really considered disabilities. So I never considered myself as a person with disabilities up until this year. And in 1998, I was housed in a private prison in Youngstown, Ohio, and I was assaulted by a few correctional officers. And that was the first time I ever had a seizure. I was never given any medication for the seizure. I was never tested to see if I had seizures or epilepsy. Nothing ever happened for me at that time. I came home in 2006, and up until that time, I was never, again, given any medication or tested, even though it was written in my files that I had a seizure. And in 2007, I had a seizure in the car with my friend. She took me to the hospital, and I was diagnosed with epilepsy and said, you know, it's going to be affecting me for the rest of my life, basically. And dealing with the epilepsy, I've dealt with a lot of depression. You know, I'd be really tired at times, you know, and I'm still working through it. The medicine is, you know, helping me somewhat, but I still have seizures every now and again. And unfortunately, but fortunately, a lot of my seizures I go into dazes, and I just stare a lot, and you know, that's, you know, how I have my seizures. You know, I've fallen out a few times, and most of my seizures are basically in my sleep, and which is a very frightening thing, because, you know, sometimes I feel I may never wake up from my seizures. But dealing with the criminal justice system and disabilities, I feel that, you know, the criminal justice system need to have more things in place for people with disabilities. I've been around men who were deaf and couldn't use the phone the way they should have used the phone. I've been around men who, you know, didn't have cells available for them with, I don't know the right terminology, but, you know, toilets with, you know, that's...
Right, with railings. Or
yeah, with railings, disability accessible. Mm-hmm. You know, toilets and things of that nature. Even men who were having seizures every day. You know, helmets wasn't available for these men, you know, when they fall out, you know, having seizures. And I think that it needs to be more done in the criminal justice system while people are in and when people are coming out, to help the men and women who have disabilities. And when I came home, I saw a doctor, and the doctor diagnosed me with PTSD. And I didn't understand what it was. And again, I went into a depression state because I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't understand the anxiety that I was having, the depression that I was having, you know, while I was separating myself from my family members and friends. And I didn't like the labels that people placed on people with disabilities. And like I said before, up until this year, I never acknowledged that what I had were disabilities, because I didn't know that they were really called disabilities. And when I came to the understanding that they were disabilities, I was kind of ashamed, because people try to label people with disabilities like we're bad people, and we're not. You know, we're just like anybody else. You know, and I think we deserve the respect and love that anyone else deserves. And I think, you know, with respectability and everybody who's a part of this process of pointing out these things, I think it's important that it be more attention placed on people with disabilities coming out of the criminal justice system. Because a lot of people are falling through the cracks with the lack of support and the lack of help that they're getting coming out of the system. And I personally believe that a lot of people are going back to prison because their disabilities are not being addressed the way they should be addressed. And I think with my dyslexia and epilepsy and PTSD, I think that it's going to be something that I'm going to have to deal with for the rest of my life. And I'm still learning how to deal with them and accept, you know, these disabilities as a part of me, but not who I am as a person. And I'm learning to deal with my self-esteem when it bothers me at times because of my disabilities. And, you know, I have a problem with, you know, my memory at times. And I'm still, again, learning to live with my disabilities and speak out about people with disabilities and disabilities. And I was explaining to Philip and Janie before the conference started that I've been speaking out on these things probably 8 years now. And a lot of people never wanted to talk about these issues. And, you know, I'm very fortunate enough to be around people now who are willing to talk about these issues and the importance, you know, of the help and support that the men and women get who are coming out of the system. And I just say thank you for letting me, you know, give my personal experience with these issues.
Well, thank you so much, Eddie, and we really appreciate your insight, your wisdom, and the hard work that you do. Everyone, there will be a chance for questions and for more dialogue once we get through the last of our slides. So make sure you get your questions queued up in the chat box on the bottom left. And moving on, Janie, I want you to take it away and start talking in detail about our report.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank Philip for the excellent job that he did presenting all that data, and I want to thank Eddie, as always, for sharing his journey to this point. And he knows, I think, the world of him. I've known Eddie for a number of years, and I'm just over the moon with the progress that he's making and what he gives back to the community. Let me just make a couple points, if I may, before I get into some of the recommendations. And that is that it's very important for many of you who are working in the field to know, and probably already do know, of the term expungement. And what that means for some of you who may not be familiar with it is that you can get your criminal record expunged, in the sense of erased to a certain degree. The police will always have access to the data, but employers, people looking to give you a loan, housing, etc., once you petition the court to request that your record be expunged or erased, and their conditions are different around the country, that helps reduce a large amount of the stigma that follow, especially young people, for the rest of their lives. Some mistake that they made at 16 should not still be present at 40, particularly if that charge was later dropped. So expungement is something that I would encourage anyone working with young people to explore. The other is the distinction of jails and prisons. Jails, as you know, are places where we are held in detention status. And it's important to note they have not been convicted of anything. So when we talk about the conditions under which many are held, these are everyday citizens just like you and me, who, but for the fact that they don't have the money to pay the bail or the other circumstances, are being held in conditions that are deplorable, quite frankly. And I say this because I've worked in prisons and jails, not only around this country, but I've had the, I don't know if you call it good fortune, but I've had the experience of traveling to jails and prisons around the world, actually. So it's just important to keep in mind these are detainees. They've been convicted of nothing. Once you go to prison, that's a whole nother situation, but still conditions need to improve.
And I would actually, if you don't mind, Janie,
yes, please.
I'm just going to jump in and add, this is where, the federal government has a particular slice of the prison population.
Oh, yeah.
It is very important that, the Bureau of Prisons, that the federal level, make its own efforts. It's very important that Congress acts. But, that covers only a slice of the pie. It only covers part of the prison population. There is a profound need for people, leaders, both self-advocates in the community and the justice system at the state level to have an impact and to work to raise the voices of people with disabilities who are in the system, and to think about, it's like, what can the state government do to support criminal justice reform, or what state laws can be changed to improve the treatment of prisoners. So I just want to...
No, excellent point, because what Phil just brought up is true. I work for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, as a matter of fact, and that is just a small percentage of the 3,200, the last time I actually had involvement in that, 3,200 jails around the country. So you can imagine the larger group of the population. And also because I also worked on Rikers Island, where the turnover was something like 90,000. Now that's New York numbers. 90,000 a year. So multiply that by the number of people who come through. So your point is well taken. The vast majority are in jail, in state and county and city facilities. A couple final points, and then we'll get on to the issue at hand, is the recidivism rate. Depending upon where you look and who you talk to, it can range anywhere from 70% to 50%, but nonetheless, it is disproportionately high. And recidivism, as we know, means prisoners who are returned to some kind of control by the criminal justice system, whether it's parole, probation, or what have you. And I did serve for a while as a United States parole commissioner, and I was astonished, and that's the word I would use, to find out how many parolees were returned to prison on what's called a technical violation. What that means essentially is they broke a rule. They didn't break a law. They didn't commit a new crime. They would be, let's say, I remember one officer bringing in a warrant for me to sign for a young man who had missed 1 day of work. Well, of course, I challenged that officer to find out why he missed work. Why would we send someone back to incarceration who was working, missed 1 day of work, his urines were clean, he was living with his family. So there are many people who will return to prison simply because of, as I said, they violated a rule, not a new law. And certain states now have taken a very active approach in reducing the number of people who will return for what's called technical parole violations. So just one other point, which I think is so important, and it just was a part of the story throughout all of the information that was provided, and that is that school-to-prison pipeline. You cannot underestimate the power that failing in school, if you look at the major indicators, which we did on Rikers Island, of chances of coming to prison, there were several, but the one I'll focus on is absolutely not completing school. And one of the things that we know is you look at the disproportionate number of, the rate rather, at which children of color are punished, even in, believe it or not, and I'm sure you guys know this, in kindergarten. In kindergarten, they are absolutely expelling, I will call them babies, for doing what babies do, and that is acting out. So there's just so much for us to do, and I just say that wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you have the responsibility, because one way or the other, we are affected by what happens in our society. And I've said this before, and it bears repeating, that service to others is the rent that we pay for occupying space on this earth. So let me just continue to go through the slides, and we'll begin with empowering parents. Yes, please.
On. I mean,
yeah, please.
Look at stigma. We talk in respectability talks about stigma in a lot of ways, and that's why we think that there's work that needs to be done with employers to overcome stigma against people with disabilities.
Yes.
Particularly, we like the fact that there are employers who are being very proactive around making a commitment to hiring returning citizens, and so that's kind of one of the many things that we see as part of the issue, and there's several campaigns we talk about that are really changing public opinions on this issue. So, well,
exactly.
Children. So I think talking about empowering parents is a good next
starting point. Thank you, and that's a very important point about the stigma, and I think Eddie just spoke to that on a very personal level of what that does, and this whole issue of stereotypes as well. So empowering parents, it really begins, and a parent is a caregiver. You didn't have to birth the child. I mean, many times these kids come from non-domicile, not being with their parents. They're coming out of foster care. I mean, the number of kids who age out is increasing, and you can also follow that pattern where many of them wind up in criminal justice because they're on the streets and have no other means of taking care of themselves. So empowering parents and families and other social supports with resources that will combat that stigma and safeguard youth with disabilities from falling through the cracks. Parenting a child with a disability can be deeply rewarding. My son, who was successful, he's 26, finished college, but he had a great deal of trouble in the early grades with reading. And there were many attempts to stigmatize him, saying that he should not be mainstreamed, he should be put into special education, And that was a real battle, but it was a battle worth fighting. So there are just a lot of resources that are available to us. I'll just mention a few because you can see the slide there. But in particular, understood.com, Autism Society, the Office of Disability Employment, the Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, and others. But I just think that that's important that parents and caregivers have the resources that they need to deal with a very powerful institution when you're dealing with schools and other entities that have limited resources. Reduce sexual assault and abuse. We have to take steps to address sexual assaults and sexual abuse of people with disabilities by ensuring that youth with disabilities and their parents and special educators understand their risks, their rights, and have access to the right resources. And I'm, again, having worked in correctional institutions, the disabled, those who have mental health challenges are actually preyed upon. People who go to prison frequently don't stop committing the crime, they just start doing it in a different place. And there are many who are not able to broker their own needs that fall victim to the system that does not, in many ways, does not keep them safe, does not screen out those predators who try to get into housing units where many of those who need help are housed. And so there are there's resources here. I mean, the numbers are probably greater than this because this data says that 59,000 adults with disabilities will be sexually assaulted each year. I suspect that number is greater because there's a stigma, and many people, particularly males, do not want to admit that this has happened. So this is just a part of the problem. So again, local resources that are available are listed there on the screen, so I won't go through every one of them. Reform broken educational policies, very important. Education is the way of achieving in our society. Education is the means for people who are looking to change their circumstances. You cannot change or minimize that reform educational policies, and such as physical restraints and school suspensions, which have disparate negative impacts on students of color and students with disability. This notion of ending of zero tolerance for drugs should also be zero tolerance for ensuring that staff understand the difference between a visible and invisible disability. If a child is staring at you and not actively acting out in some way, they're probably in shock. So the last thing you need to do, or one would need to do if they're not representing a threat to themselves or anyone else, is rethink that need for a restraint. And the notion of school resource officers, even though you've seen some in the news who've been physically handling students, their role there is to de-escalate. The role that they were originally created for, and I've been around the business long enough to remember when this was just a concept, and they came to the White House actually to promote the notion of school resource officers. I'm talking about 1997, and what it has changed into, morphed into, was not the original intent. So scale back, but certainly refocus and redirect it. And there's such programs, and some of these I'm very familiar with. I was on the board of communities and schools. I've worked with some of the people who were trailblazers in restorative justice, and I can't underscore enough how much their creative approach is something that, if you're not familiar with, I would ask you to become so. The responsive classroom approach, South Carolina school policy forbidding the use of SROs to discipline students, it was never that intent. The school resource officer was to be there to help, to assist, particularly those who weren't able to broker their own needs. The next one, improve effective youth programs. This is one that is so near and dear to my heart. Mentoring programs and expanding early work experiences to empower youth with disabilities. This will make the difference actually in life or death. If you can give a young person a successful opportunity to transition from school to work, requires a great effort. Government cannot do it all. Government is reactive by nature, and we are talking about being proactive. But mentorship, paid and unpaid, internship programs, paid and unpaid, will make a difference in giving a child an opportunity to be good at something, to feel positive about themselves, and help them gain skills like, this is what it takes. You got to get up every morning, even though you don't want to, get to work, and do all the things that are required. But more importantly, it is that high expectation. Children and adults really live up to the level of expectation that's set for them. And it's that soft underbelly where we just want to say, oh, they're not capable. We have to give them all these supports. No, the more we challenge them and give them the resources that they need, that is the true opportunity to just let them see their wings, that they have wings, and what they're for. So there's the National Mentoring Partnership, has a detailed report referring youth in juvenile justice settings to mentoring programs, the Division of Youth Services in Indiana, and there are probably more that you guys can probably share with us as well. So I can't underscore enough how important that is. The next one is...
talking about ending criminalization of homelessness, and I say this because, among other things, the Denver City Council has been very aggressive in locking people up for panhandling and preventing people from staying overnight in parks. And if you start interacting with the system for a minor charge of panhandling, that can kind of become a spiral of becoming criminalized and being put into prison. And very often we talk about prisons being the new mental asylum.
Absolutely.
Criminalizing homelessness is part. And so we talk in our report about, for example, San Antonio, which has found that it's more cost-effective to provide home and community-based services rather than just kicking somebody into prison and saying, oh, well, now we've solved homelessness. I'm also going to touch on reforming policing, which again is, a very complicated matter. As Jennifer Mathis of the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law recently wrote to me in an email, almost all police encounters with people with disabilities are preventable in the first place, and being reactive is not where we want to be. We're going to be hosting in January a special conversation with Special Olympics about the work they've been doing to train police officers on disability issues. And while we want to prevent negative violent encounters between police and civilians, be protective of public safety, and we think that police training is part of the solution, but it's only part, and we can't just say, oh, we're just going to tack on some disability training at the police academy. That will not solve the problem. Yeah.
Okay. Let's continue with juvenile. Let juvenile justice lead somewhere, except as it currently is situated, to be a feeder for the adult system. If you look at the number of juveniles that later wind up in adult facilities, when you talk about that pipeline, there's so many places that we need to interdict and make a difference. Provide better resources to the juvenile justice system so that justice-involved youth are not trapped in the school-to-prison pipeline. And there's even a notion now of what we call the cradle-to-prison pipeline. They're just services that babies need to thrive, and when they don't get those, it just continues that almost conveyor belt that leads them to a place where none of them actually should be. Youth with disabilities who are on probation are particularly those with cognitive disorders, those that you can't see, they can't. You give them 6 things to do, and at the third one, and they try very hard, they're confused, and many of the intake officers take that as being unruly, and it's simply not understanding what the requirements are. There's a Tools for Success curriculum developed by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. I also want to mention one that I'm becoming more familiar with, and that's the Equal Justice Initiative run now by Brian Stevenson, who has written an incredible book called Just, J-U-S-T, Mercy, that lays out I think, a very cogent and comprehensive plan for dealing with our juvenile justice, juvenile justice issue in this country. We need to expand alternative sentencing programs that are critical to decreasing juvenile incarceration and ensuring youth with disabilities are no longer trapped by the pipeline into the justice system. There are a host, and I'll mention a few that are here, of programs and models, innovative, encouraging best practices that offer alternatives to incarceration at no risk to the community. It's a net savings to the budget, and many of our cities and states are facing financial challenges, so it's just a win-win situation. But many of the kids who are in some way suffering with or affected by a disability, and particularly those who are disabled or have a disability and a person of color, it just increases the chance exponentially that they will not be referred for an ATI or alternative option there.
And also, I'll jump ahead and
Please.
hop on the next slide.
Please.
One of the big things that we emphasize throughout this is that, people with disabilities interact with the justice system in many different ways. They interact with it as witnesses, as alleged perpetrators, and as returning citizens. We're not just talking about crime here. We're talking about a whole host of issues. And even being able to give your testimony as a victim or in a criminal proceeding against someone who is victimized or committed violence against you can be a challenge if somebody has a disability. And so one of the elements we look at is, how do you actually have a accessible courtroom? And we're not talking just, ramps, but we're talking about ASL available. Or whether or not there's the right to counsel, or whether people are actually being able to get a good lawyer who will understand their disability issues. And so, for example, we talk about the Center for Legal and Court Technologies efforts with the American Foundation for the Blind. We talk about California Department of Corrections efforts in their Developmental Disabilities Program, and I encourage you to look more at those. One of the biggest issues, and I'm sure Eddie can talk about this more, is the huge impact that solitary confinement can have on people. Not only is it a profoundly traumatizing experience if somebody already has a disability, but it can create a disability. It's particularly traumatic for prisoners who have, underlying mental health or other conditions. And there's some efforts out there, such as Senator Chris Coons of Delaware's bill, which would instruct stricter rules around the use of solitary confinement. There's obviously will always be an unfortunate need if somebody is truly profoundly violent and a threat to others, but so often solitary is just used as a recourse to saying, oh, this prisoner has X issue, we're just going to lock them up and make sure they never talk to another person again.
Go ahead.
Did you want to say something about solitary?
Yeah, the effects of solitary confinement. I did 10 years in solitary confinement, 6 years in the ADX prison in Florence, Colorado, which is the highest level prison in the United States. And the effects, of these prisons and solitary confinement, we will never know the end result of how it really affected people. But I can tell you now, I've been home for 10 years, and I still will lock myself in my room and eat my dinner at times. I still will go in my room and be alone, and I have a family, I have kids, I have a wife, and it's still affecting me. So, and I can't tell you all the ways how it affected me, but I know that it's had a great effect on me in my life. So I think that, when prisons are using solitary confinement, it should be restrictions and laws against how long people are being held in solitary confinement, because a lot of people are being mentally and emotionally destroyed by being housed in these solitary confinement prisons and jails for too long. So I hope that there can be more legislation done to help, restrict some of the time that people can be held in solitary confinement.
I think there's also the issue about suicides that occur in prisons and jails. And one of the years that I was working in New York City, we had one suicide per month for 11 straight months. And when you started looking at the conditions a number of them were in solitary confinement. And I don't know if I've seen any reports that draw any conclusions or observations from the relationship of solitary confinement and attempts of suicide, either actively in prison or once they leave. So that's an area that just begs for new and additional resources to find out what are the short and long-term effects of isolation, which is antithetical to what human beings need.
And to that, I would just add that I think we talk about this in our report, is that many correctional systems don't have good ways of tracking medical records or disability history or prescription records of the prisoners they house. I mean, the only report I could find in our research, and I had 3 people working on doing research, of a direct answer about whether or not state prisons could track disability status of the prisoners. It was 21 states, and it was a report that was 15 years old. So part of the process needs to be, the prisoners that are in the system need to have better records, and those records need to reflect the need for accommodations or disability issues. And so one of the things we talk about is that the correction systems need to have structures in place that will diagnose and accommodate people with a range of disabilities. Eddie talked about, helmets if somebody has, at a risk of having a seizure and falling from a top bunk of a bed, or being able to access canes if they have a mobility issue. Perhaps civilians who have disability issues might take the ability to, count on that stability of a cane for support and it's just for granted. Yet for somebody in prison, that difference which could prevent them from injuring themselves further, oh, well, you can't have that. That's a weapon. And
absolutely.
So that's, again, part of the process. And actually, we have, at RespectAbility, received letters from prisoners with disabilities calling out for help, and we're a small nonprofit working on these issues. And so this is where the state protection and advocacy agencies have a profound role, such as NDRN, Disability Rights Washington, or any of the other state organizations. And again, it goes back to, it's like when a person enters the system, day one, if they have a disability issues, that needs to be recorded and they needs to be tracked. And so we're excited that the Every Student Succeeds Act looks at the criminal and juvenile justice system and will now be requiring states to consider disability assessment as part of the intake process.
That's so important, and it starts with the training. Most correctional institutions, facilities now, require that you have at least a high school diploma to work there, and many require that you have at least an Associate of Arts and some even a degree, or in many instances now they're requiring that you have a college degree. So one of the things that we need to, when we talk about the end result of the behavior that goes on in the institutions, is what goes on in those training academies, besides teaching them self-defense and important things like that, is how are they training their staff before they go into local, federal, and state institutions of the rights of individuals. And so, because truthfully, some of it is out of ignorance, and some of it is just the fact that they have not had the information. But continuing that theme about corrections education programs that are funded under Title II of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act need to better serve prisoners with disabilities. From the beginning of incarceration, people behind bars need training in skills to successfully reintegrate into society, particularly those who've been there for a while. Maybe they went in before smartphones. If they've been in more than 10 years, there were no smartphones. So how do you do that? But there are some resources. The Khan Academy, I'm a big fan of that. If you haven't researched that, the massive online courses, TED Talks, and other kinds of learning opportunities. Hawaii is very progressive in a lot of areas. One is dealing with health of babies, as a matter of fact. But Hawaii coordinates efforts between its corrections department and the Department of Ed to provide highly qualified teachers and counselors so that returning citizens can be prepared. And we spend a lot of money. Go ahead.
Another example that I would encourage people to look at is something called the Prison University Project, located at San Quentin in California. my boss, Jennifer Mizrahi, had the opportunity a couple months ago to visit their program and to look at, these people who are in the system, and they have the chance to learn how to write computer code.
Wow.
That's a really marketable skill.
Absolutely.
And, there are companies that are saying, okay, you're a returning citizen. Well, we're going to look past your criminal record because I can see you completed this innovative program and actually know how to, do the work that we need to be done. So
that's very encouraging. Continuing on with capacity building, our part to play, we need to extend and expand capacity through through non-governmental supports, focused on providing reentry solutions for returning citizens. As Philip said earlier, 95% are returning at some point, and I think we're in the Washington, D.C. area, greater metropolitan area, approximately 3,000 return to the District of Columbia per year. So there has to be a plan, but that plan, I'm getting a little ahead of it, starts on day one. Volunteers, nonprofits, philanthropists, state-based, we all have a role to play. The work is so important that we need to just build those relationships and not be stovepiping or working in ways that we don't leverage each other's success and building on that. The philanthropy roundtable, clearing obstacles to work, compiles proven programs for successful reentry for returning citizens. The Center for Employment Opportunities is another, the RIDGE project. I mean, you can read these things, but there are other resources that are available, but these are just a few that we highlight. Philip made the point, please.
I already made this point, but again, we want to emphasize, if there was one of the many things that I think a criminal justice reform piece of legislation could do would be to look at the data piece of people who are in federal and state prisons, and trying to assess whether state correctional programs have the data capacity to track disability issues or to flag them. And as ever, we think that the more data that can be collected through systems, that can really drive performance metrics and engagement. Speaking of engagement in a different way, we want to talk about engaging employers because, again, people who come out of the system need to have a place to go to work. And for example, CEO, they're very effective with their violence that they're working with because they get them a job on day one out of the system. They start creating high expectations, and they're learning marketable skills. In the Los Angeles metropolitan area, the Robertson Economic Development Fund has a lot of training programs for folks who are returning citizens to gain valuable work skills and to go to work, develop a work history, develop work habits, and there's a lot of different programs that we talk about. Banning the box, for example, preventing employers from, immediately disqualifying somebody because of a criminal issue in their past is important. Yes, if you're dealing with money or children, an employer needs to know if somebody has interacted with the system, certainly, but we can do it in a non-discriminatory way.
And in many jurisdictions, it's you can only ask about convictions. Many people don't know that it is illegal to ask someone about an arrest, but that is something that banning the box would help expand on that. So with that, let's continue talking about expanding innovative recidivism reduction. We talked earlier about the WIOA funding to address recidivism, channeling the power of social entrepreneurship. And I know that's very important to many organizations, particularly to millennials who are coming along, who feel that that's a way that they can make a difference and have an impact. Utilizing pay-for-performance contracting is documented by Social Finance, the Center for Employment Opportunities Pay for Success project in New York State, growing power of social enterprise to combat recidivism through public-private partnerships, and I cannot stress that enough. There are so many partnerships that could be strengthened and leveraged if we provide that vehicle between government and private entities, such as the Second Chance Act, which we need to talk about as opposed to, which is what our final, well, at least my final here, is the Second Chance Act, not three strikes. California learned that lesson. with this three strikes and you're locked up forever. The state almost went bankrupt because you build a bed, you'll fill a bed. We need to change the narrative from three strikes to second chances by focusing outreach on business leaders, human resource professionals, returning citizens, faith-based. I mean, every one of us has a responsibility to do what we can, whether it's just outside your house, outside your city, or wherever you find yourself. And the best way to fight stigma is to let employers see the facts of other employers who are already succeeding. Nothing succeeds like success. There are tax credits that they can get. There are all kinds of benefits for hiring people with disabilities, whether or not they were in the correctional system.
And I know this has been a long and very detailed presentation. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us and learning with us today. If there's anybody who's really dying to ask a question, I would encourage you to look at the chat box on the bottom left, type out your question, we will address it, and we'll talk through kind of our ideas, and we'll also invite you to attend some of our future webinars. I see we already had a first question from Alia Bakavan, who asked, well, what about mental and emotional disabilities? We talked about that a little bit. There's a two-part answer to your question. On slide 26, where we talk about a report from several years ago about the demographics of the incarcerated population, you'll see that bottom bullet point there about somebody identifying as having a mental health problem. That was in 2004, 58% of people were incarcerated. So mental health challenges are common, whether they are what drove somebody into the system because of Criminalization of Homelessness or inadequate supports in the community, or, as Eddie was talking about, the traumatic experience of being in the system resulting in lasting mental health issues. The emotional piece is a little harder to parcel out. The data set we used to develop this report didn't separate emotional disability separate from cognitive disability. So the category of cognitive disability covered intellectual, developmental, traumatic brain injury, and such. So there isn't that particular thread that's been able to be pulled out of what we have. And again, it goes back to we just don't have enough data to really dig in and look at how many have emotional experience, emotional issues driving the issues. Sorry, my computer connection is a little slow, but Janie or Eddie, was there anything on mental health and emotional disabilities that you wanted to add, or I mean, I have other questions I can ask.
No, I think you covered. It's just an area that perhaps in the future we can continue to research.
Definitely. Doesn't look like we have any more chat box questions, so I'm going to actually ask Eddie a question, as it's my prerogative as a moderator. I wonder, Eddie, I was wondering if you could talk about your work with One by One and the work that you do in the community. So kind of talk us through what you do now, what you're running, and what you're hoping to accomplish.
I started doing community. I came in 2006, and I started doing community work approximately the end of 2007. And I started just helping men and women in the D.C. area who was coming out of prison. And in 2009, I started One by One. And One by One was started because I saw a gap in my area where I wanted to help people genuinely. I wanted to help the families. I wanted to help people who were coming out of prison, understand how we can do better and how we can get back into the community and do better things for people. But One by One also do preventive work where we go to high schools and colleges and talk to young people about staying on the right track and why it's important to live the best way that you can live and respect the law and respect others. So over the years, we have done a lot of things with law enforcement where we've done community events where we collected items to donate to Children's Hospital, to women's shelters, to battered women and men. I've done trainings with probation officers, social workers, lawyers, around the criminal justice system, how to treat people when they're coming out of the system. And I think now I'm being pushed in, which is a good thing. One by one now, we'll start looking at disability and sooner than later, because I have disability, so I think it's important to start trying to focus as much as we can around disability somewhat to try to help out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eddie. We have another question from the chat box, and it's a little bit long question, but I'll read it out. The term special ed has such a negative stigma historically and is heavily avoided by many communities. However, and this is them asking us, what are your thoughts on a child who presents mild speech and language delays and may actually benefit from receiving accommodations and services? However, when the family resists the categorization, is it due to the perceived larger problem of the special ed system in some schools, or is it just a label that is now attached to the child? I'll present kind of my perspective from what we talked through in our report. We think that, obviously, special ed is important, and for many children, it can be a life-changing benefit to get the supports and services that they need to succeed in school. At the same time, there are some instances where they're not getting the services and supports that they deserve and that they need. And something that we think is critically important to go back to, we talked about high expectations. We think that part of our analysis is that many children don't receive the supports and services that they need because of internalized stigma, because people are fearful of having their child be labeled as, forgive the language, the disabled kid, or being separated out, or abused, or bullied. And so our analysis is that we think that too many parents don't push for their kids to get the supports they need because they don't know what they need to know, and they don't know what they're legally entitled to, or what their right or what it means to have access to a free and appropriate public education. And so we think that stigma holds parents back from, they love their children, of course, but it's out of that love that they don't get their children the support that they need. It may also be the internalized stigma of, well, they're already from a minority community, and they don't want the double discrimination of being Hispanic, Latino, Asian, African American, and disabled, because there is still so much stigma. So it's complicated, and I think looking ahead, there's going to be a big push for more school choice, more vouchers under this new administration, and voucher programs have a very inconsistent record in serving students with disabilities and a very inconsistent record on special education. So that's my rather nebulous answer to your question, ma'am. Janie, it looks like you have something more to add.
Yeah, it's probably more, well, it's not probably, it is more of a personal story. As I mentioned, when my son was a little guy, he was doing well in everything except reading, and we were, fortunate enough to be able to have him tested independent of the school, because that was my concern. My concern was they were going to label him special ed and put him in those classes, and that in of itself was not my concern. But what I did notice when I looked at the curriculum, that many of them were not getting the services they needed. They were just being put into a special category, but the services didn't follow. So I think it's appropriate for parents and caregivers to go in with a skeptical optimism, and I say skeptical optimism, the whole notion of trust but verify. Find out what services are actually being provided, and not just in theory, but what's the relationship between the number of services available and the number of students who need them. Because there are all kinds of ways to say, well, we have X, but then when you dig deeper, there's a waiting list for a speech class, or there's a waiting list for X, Y, and Z. So in my instance, I was extremely vigilant. You can probably tell from my type A personality that I asked the questions. I was able to provide services beyond what the school offered, but at the same time, that's your tax dollar, and you are entitled to get those services for your child or someone else's child. But it is being vigilant. It is absolutely holding them accountable and being available when possible, even if you have to do it on a conference call, of getting those updates and letting people know that you are monitoring your child's progress.
Eddie, do you have something to add on the special education front?
Yes, I think it's, I just want to echo what Philip and Janie said. I think it's a lot that goes with the negative stigma that's placed on it, and sometimes the lack of programs that are in some school districts. And I think it's very important if a child needs this help, you know, and the parent can find out if these programs are really there, allow the child to get the help, you know. But I think, you know, with dealing with a lot of special education classes in D.C., a lot of angry young people in these classes because a lot of these young people wasn't getting the help that they deserve. You might have a child that have a problem with reading, and they put them in special ed class. But the special ed class is not really helping with reading. They just trying to keep the kids in there to the end of the day.
Right.
So if it's a situation like that, I wouldn't advise anybody to put their kid in there. But if it's a situation where the child is genuinely getting the help that they need, I mean, we need to look past the stigma and understand that this child needs the help and allow the services to help the child and the parents help as much as they can as well.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any more chat box questions, so I'm going to wrap things up by inviting you to talking a little bit about our upcoming webinars. As ever, thank you so much to JP Morgan Chase for supporting our webinar programs and helping us provide free webinars with closed captioning to our audience. I actually hope you'll join us tomorrow. Tomorrow we have a presentation about the Bridges from School to Work program, supported by the Marriott Foundation for People with Disabilities. We're going to be joined by Tad Asbury, who's going to talk about what Bridges is doing with those youth. They've got some wonderful programs, model cities, that I think have really profound lessons for a lot of folks. We talked about mentoring today. We're going to have a webinar about mentoring on Tuesday, December 13th. I'm going to be joined by Derek Shields of the National Disability Mentoring Coalition, and he's going to talk about his work and the value of mentoring as a tool to support employment for youth with disabilities. And we talked about police violence, police training, and we've got a webinar coming up in a few, probably in January. The date may change, but for now we've got scheduled for Tuesday, January 17th, a webinar with Special Olympics about the work they've been doing to train police on disability issues. We're going to be joined by Timothy Schreiber, who's the chair of Special Olympics. We will also have Angela Coquillo, who's the chief legal officer of Special Olympics, as well as a representative from the law enforcement community to talk about what they've been doing. And also we will be joined by Patty Saylor, the mother of the young man Ethan Saylor, whose life was ended in police custody and has really brought attention. But we're going to, you know, talk through a lot of difficult issues, and I realize that's also the week of Martin Luther King's birthday and the inauguration. So we're, you know, embracing that call to justice and that dream of a better day. And so I hope you'll be able to join us for those upcoming webinars. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and that concludes today's webinar.
The attendees are now unmuted. The moderator has ended the conference.